The title of my lecture is The Person with the Diagnosis. Since I am American, I wanted to clarify the lecture is not about Donald Trump. This topic of the person goes way back. William Osler, the esteemed physician, once said it is more important to know the person with the illness than the illness the person has. But apparently, Osler had even more ancient references to this quotation. Hippocrates, who said, "It's more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of disease a person has." And in addition, we have Maimonides, "The physician should not treat the disease, but the patient who is suffering from it." So there's a common thread here, of course, and the common thread is that we need to look at the person. Now, this is not that easy. The person is an elusive concept. I looked in the dictionary. Definition 1, an individual human being. Not very helpful. Number 2, the actual self or being of an individual. So what is the self? Let's look at the self for a while. This is something philosophers have struggled with for centuries. Hume said, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception, if anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him." Now, for those of you who are James Joyce scholars, Ulysses very much has this theme, and Leopold Bloom's concern is that he is always running into perception rather than what he himself thinks. Where is the I? Now, another problem is that self is both subject and object. Think of this sentence: I think of myself. Part of the self is the phenomenal I of philosophy that is doing the thinking. Another part of the self is a representation of who I am. I think of myself in a certain way. So how can self be both subject and object? Are the contents of consciousness what constitutes the self? So the more you think about this, the more difficult it becomes. In this well-known painting, we see the issue of memory, and memory we think of as the cornerstone of self-continuity. The self can be defined as the aggregate of personal memories and the social personas associated with them. Or as one of my favorite filmmakers, Luis Buñuel, says, the self is memory. Now, the cortex itself is wired by memories, as you can see in this slide, so that we are constantly laying down memories that tell us who we are, remind us who we are. And then we get into another complexity, is that there is a conscious self and an unconscious self. Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, says, I may understand and be able to apply the term I to myself without knowing what I really am. So much of the much of the self is hidden from us. We have aspects of the self that are repressed or split off and disavowed because they are unacceptable. Most of us think of the most positive aspects of ourselves, and that is what counts. But we are all masters of self-deception. This is what psychiatrists do when they get to know the patient well. They learn that the patient has used self-deception to protect himself from seeing himself. This cartoon says, "The problem with you is that you try to be a lot nicer than you really are." Typical marital conflict here. Self is also multiplicity. It's not one thing. None of us are only one self. Galen Strawson, the philosopher, says, "There simply isn't any I or self that goes on through the waking day, even though there's obviously an I or self at any given time." And a paradox of psychoanalytic work is that as patients learn to tolerate the multiple facets of the self, they begin to experience themselves as more coherent. We have to accept we have different aspects of the self. It is not monolithic. Buddha, who is not a psychiatrist, said, "The self is only a conventional name given to a set of elements." The other thing we all know is the self is context dependent. Our self varies depending on whom we are with. Daniel Dennett, the consciousness researcher, said, "Selves are not independently existing soul pearls, but artifacts of the social processes that create us." Different aspects of the self are evoked by different figures and different settings in our environment. We change who we are, how we relate, depending on that context. In fact, culture is one of the most important aspects of determining the self. One of the Chinese novelists that I have great admiration for is Gish Chen, and in her book, she makes a point that Asian culture is not centered in self-experience. That would be a very strange way to go about looking at the self in China. She says, there is an interdependent self that's created by parenting that focuses on social context. In the United States, there's a great emphasis on being an independent individual. In Chinese culture, very much you're part of a family, part of a social context. Now, there's one caveat here that is important. The self is not the same thing as the person. And we're looking for a definition of person, and I've told you half of it so far. That's the self and how we see ourselves. Now, there is a self observed by you, a self observed by others, and it's complicated to determine which is the more valid view of who you are. Here's a very simple experiment. If you see yourself on videotape, no one likes that. You know, I teach psychiatric residents and they watch themselves interview and they say, I don't look like that. And my voice doesn't sound like that. I hate myself, you know. And what's funny is in these classrooms is someone is saying, I don't look like that. But the person sitting next to them says, oh yes, you look exactly like that. That's how you look. They say, no. And they say, my voice doesn't sound like that. And the person sitting next to them says, yes, your voice sounds exactly like that. And there's an argument. No, I hear my voice all the time. I don't sound like that. Oh, yes, you do, the other person says. So there's a striking contrast when you look at videotapes as to how others actually see you versus how you think you look. And often it leads to this self-hatred I described. Most people don't like to watch themselves on video. So my first conclusion is we do not see ourselves like others see us, no matter how hard we try. That's why we need a psychiatrist to look at us in a way that we don't see and tell the person what they look like, how they appear. Now, this is my dog. His name is Ralphie. Now, he looks very sad. We agree? Everyone would say he looks sad? Okay. What you can't see is that his tail is wagging and he's happy. It doesn't show in the picture because the picture is cut off. But this is the way Ralphie looks when he's happy. Okay? Now, from the outside, others cannot always see how we feel inside. This happens with patients all the time. I say to a patient, "You look like you're feeling better today." The patient says, "No. Why did you think that?" I say, "You look happy." "No, I don't feel happy," the patient says. So we are deceived often as well. Now there's a third conclusion here. Knowing who the person is requires two perspectives integrated together, an inside perspective and an outside perspective. In psychotherapy, a good therapist oscillates. First, they take an empathic role of getting inside the patient's head, feeling what is it like to be this person. But then they take an objective view back into their own mind, and they see how does this patient come across to others and affect others. Now, as we go on this journey to look at the person, I want to talk about some of the current problems in the field of psychiatry. When we switch from Axis 4 to Axis 5 in the United States, we have both advantages and disadvantages. The good thing about Axis 2 in the training centers where all over the United States where we were training psychiatrists is Axis 2 forced clinicians to think about personality. But the sad outcome was this. Most busy psychiatrists would actually ignore Axis 2 because they didn't have time to get into the person. As a result, deferred was the most common diagnosis on Axis 2, which means maybe later when I have time I'll get around to looking at it. Now, why was Axis 2 created? According to Robert Spitzer, the creator of Axis 2, he wanted to be sure psychiatrists could do psychotherapy with a group of patients, and he thought, well, the personality disorders would be the group where they could all do psychotherapy. Now, a psychiatric resident very frequently says to me when I'm supervising, I think the patient has some Axis 2 stuff. Now, Axis 2 stuff invariably meant something bad. The patient is obnoxious, difficult, angry, manipulative, or otherwise unpleasant. So Axis 2 became marginalized as when you don't like the patient, you put something in Axis 2 on the patient. But it's not synonymous with being antisocial, demanding, unpleasant, or difficult. Some personality disorders, such as obsessive-compulsive, are diagnosable in people standing next to you in white coats in the hospital. And I always tell my residents, if you don't have some obsessive-compulsive features, you won't be a good doctor. So you have to have something of this. But not all of the Axis 2 features are meaning you're a bad person. So this distinction may have raised awareness of personality disorders, but the Axis 1 and Axis 2 distinction unwittingly reduced Axis 2 to a pejorative adjective. It also led some to think that the person was not relevant to Axis 1 conditions. Now, to further complicate things, a personality disorder is not the same thing as the person. Okay, we all have a person within us. We all do not have personality disorders. So who is the person? The term defies easy categorization, as I have demonstrated. The person involves what is unique and idiosyncratic, a complex amalgam of multiple variables. Genes and environment interact to produce who we are. It's not either or, it's both and, both genes and environment. And in the neural networks, throughout development, we are laying down representations of self and other in the neural networks. Genomic expression is actually highly influenced by environment, as numerous studies show. Experience leads to the laying down of neural networks that become the basis of self-image and the expectations of how others will see us. Representations of people, objects, and situations in the brain are stored in the matrix of connections, the synapses. So, as Schatz said years ago, neurons that fire together wire together. Now, what about personal identity? This does not necessarily overlap with genomic identity. In the UK, they have been studying monozygotic twins who have identical genomes but have highly distinct characteristics in terms of their personalities. So if we wanted to summarize the determinants of the person, this is what we would say. I have it on this slide. The subjective experience of oneself based on a unique historical narrative, but that's filtered through the lens of specific meanings. All narratives are idiosyncratically determined by how we think. Number 2, a set of conscious and unconscious conflicts and defenses, representations and self-deceptions. Number 3, a set of internalized interactions with others that are unconsciously reenacted, creating impressions in others. Number 4, our physical characteristics. If you are a 7-foot-tall basketball player versus a 5-foot-tall individual, you have very different experiences of your personhood. Our brain is a product of genes and interaction with environmental forces and the creation of neural networks by the cumulative experience. That must be taken into account. And of course, our culture, our social affiliations are very important in shaping who the person is, as are religious and spiritual beliefs. Finally, our cognitive style and capacities will make a big difference in who we are as a person. So these are some of the key determinants. Let me tell you about a patient where I can illustrate some of these issues of the person. This woman was 44 years old, and she came to see me when she was a teacher suffering from recurrent depression. She had self-depreciation and really hated herself. And one of the reasons was she had complete lack of sexual desire for her husband. Her husband was a very nice man, she said, but she never felt desire. And she was haunted by traumatic memories when her father had incest with her from the age of 6 to the age of 12. And she continued to think about the horrible incest experience as something that she could not understand or fully integrate. Her absence of the sexual response or desire led to an ascetic self-view as one who does not need pleasure. She became a long-distance runner and was gaining self-esteem by the fact that she could run 15 kilometers or 20 kilometers, constantly getting farther and farther, and that she could take the self-punishment with a stoic attitude. She was deeply devoted to the life and the care of her 2 boys and her job as a teacher and self-improvement, but she had very little pleasure in her life. Now, she continued to have this conviction that she was thoroughly bad. And like many victims of sexual abuse, she blamed herself for the incest with her father. And she kept thinking, I did something wrong. I was bad to be treated that way. Now, there was constant aggression towards her parents, but she felt that's not acceptable, so she would redirect it to herself. And she also would read the Bible and say, I must be a very bad person. Now, she lived with this expectation that it was dangerous to feel good because any moment lightning would strike. If you felt good, something bad would happen for sure. So she did not have positive expectations of others. When she came into my office for the first time, she chose the seat, the chair, farthest from me. Most people would sit in the chair across from me. She went to the other side of the room. I said, why are you sitting way over there? And she said, the Hopi Indians have a saying. Each person finds the seat that is best for her in every room. And this is the seat that's best for me. Later, I could understand why she needed the distance. Her interpersonal distance grew out of severe trauma from an older man, her father. She clung to suicidality as an escape hatch from intolerable situations. She always thought about suicide, but never acted on it. I was reminded of the famous Nietzsche quote, "The thought of suicide has helped me through many a difficult night." This was the way with my patient. Now let's look at the impact of childhood sexual abuse from its biological perspective. Some of you may be aware of the work of Christine Heim in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Her group published in 2013 a fascinating MRI study. They took adult women who as children had been sexually traumatized. They found that exposure to childhood sexual abuse was associated with cortical thinning in the area of the brain where the genitals were represented, in the homunculus and in the primary somatosensory cortex. It's very thin cortex. And the view of her research group was that neuroplasticity may protect the child from the sensory processing of specific abuse experiences, but it also contributes to a deadening of the sexual responses. So this child grew up with no sexual desire, no sexual feeling, and was quite puzzled by it. Now, briefly, before I stop, I just will mention some treatment implications of the person and why we need to think about the person. First of all, we don't treat disorders in isolation. We treat a person with a disorder. And this is something I have to teach psychiatric residents who often want to make a quick diagnosis using DSM-5 symptoms and immediately prescribe a drug, and they don't know anything about the person except the symptoms. Now, the person of the therapist must also be taken into account. We have to recognize that we are reacting to things the patient talks about, and we may not want to hear certain things. But we have to study how the patient is affecting us, because they will unconsciously recreate experiences from their background with us in the present. And the main thing I always teach residents is treatment is not simply a series of procedures. You take time to get to know the person. Psychotherapy research again and again shows that the therapeutic alliance is the most powerful predictor of outcome, far more important than the particular technique. It also applies to prescribing and pharmacotherapy. The National Institute of Mental Health study years ago in late 1980s showed that several treatments for depression helped. There were 4 cells of the study: interpersonal therapy, cognitive therapy, imipramine, and placebo. Here's what they found. The medication worked better if there was a good therapeutic alliance with the doctor, just like the therapies did. Placebo worked better if there was a good therapeutic alliance. In our hurry to do things quickly, we may forget the therapeutic alliance, and we're probably not doing the patient any favors by forgetting about the alliance. But we all hate complexity. This is a big problem with we doctors. We don't have enough time to see the patient. We don't want to get complex. We don't want to see the multiple layers of the person. We want to rush on to the next patient and get through. We prefer simple, reductive thinking. Almost all of us are like that. We have to push ourselves to think in terms of the whole person. Getting to know the person takes time, and time is money. So, this is a study that I thought was fascinating. This was in the Journal of Internal Medicine in the United States. They had primary care doctors with a tape recorder in their office, okay? A patient would come into the primary care doctor and start to tell his story. The average doctor interrupted the patient in 18 seconds to start asking specific questions. Yeah, don't bother me with your story. I want to ask you about specific symptoms. Now, this is a huge problem, because if you want to know the person, you listen to his story. Everyone will tell you a narrative that says a lot about them, their illness, their symptoms, and it's worth taking time to let the patient expand on what that narrative is, because they'll get better care. You'll probably enjoy your work more. But getting to know the person can be unsettling to the clinician. That's another thing we need to recognize. Listening to my patient that I told you about with the incestuous relationship with the father was deeply disturbing to me. but she needed someone to listen to that, and I wanted to hear her story. And so I felt I had to take the time to hear the details of the incest. Technology is another problem that we're facing right now. I cannot speak authoritatively about Italy, but in the United States, there is tremendous pressure to do electronic medical records while you're seeing the patient. So this is what often happens in an office in the United States. The patient is over there talking. The doctor is facing away from the patient typing because they have only 15 minutes and they're trying to get all the information in, and there's literally no eye contact going on. So this is another problem that many people complain about, and many eminent professors in the United States say we have to do something about this problem. So let me just end, because I know you all have been sitting patiently, and I thank you for that. Several points about bringing back the person. Let the patient tell his or her story without interrupting. Note the nonverbal behavior, because much of the self, much of the person, comes out in the way they wince when they talk about their father, the way they turn away when they bring up their mother. Whatever it may be, things are going to come out nonverbally. And then let the patient supervise you. This is great wisdom for anyone who does therapy. We often are going on the wrong track, but the patient will try to help bring us back by telling us what's important. And finally, keep in mind, a patient wants a doctor who knows them. They're not as interested if the doctor has all kinds of awards on his wall, but they want to feel like this doctor knows who I am. And this is how you keep patients coming back, by knowing them. So finally, my last slide is a quote from Emil Kraepelin, of all people, from 1920. The affective and schizophrenic forms of mental illness do not represent the expression of particular pathological processes, but rather indicate the areas of our personality in which these processes unfold. Thank you very much.